Good evening, and thank you for attending our Iowa History Book Club tonight. We are so glad that you are here, virtually, of course. So my name is Andrew, and I am the editor of the Annals of Iowa here at the State Historical Society of Iowa. The Annals is our quarterly history journal, and tonight we're going to be hosting a conversation. We're going to be kicking off our 2022 State Historical Society Iowa History Book Club, excuse me. I'm getting so excited, I'm talking over myself. And during this book club series throughout the year, we're going to hear from authors who are going to discuss all periods of Iowa history and discuss all corners of the state. And you can learn more about that series and our programs on our website at iowaculture.gov. Just like this one, though, you'll have to register for each one individually. So just be aware. Today, though, we are kicking off our 2022 Iowa History Book Club with Storm Lake, the book I have right here. The Storm Lake, A Chronicle of Change, Resilience, and Hope from a Heartland Newspaper by Art Cullen. And we are so excited to have you with us here tonight, Art. But before we get started, I just want to offer a few housekeeping notes, and then I'll introduce Art a little more formally, but we're very excited for this. First, we want to look forward to a Q&A session with Art after he and I have our conversation, but you can put those questions into the Q&A feature, which is right there along the bottom, at any time throughout the evening. So if you've got a question and you know you want to ask it, you can put that in right away. My colleague Jennifer Cooley and I will receive whatever you put into the chat, and we'll be able to pose those questions to Art a little later. So we've got some questions we'll start with, but there's lots of time for you all to do that. Also, just another note, we do have closed captioning available for those who might want it. It's just at the bottom of your screen as well. It's an action bar. You may have to click the three dots that say more, but you'll be able to see either a transcript or closed captioning. And finally, I just want to highlight that by participating in this book club, you do agree to engage respectfully with the presenter and the hosts and others who are participating, and that includes in the Q&A feature. So any type of harassing or disruptive behavior, including in that Q&A feature, is prohibited. And that includes, but isn't limited to, abusive or derogatory comments, slurs or epithets, threats or acts of violence, intimidation, misgendering, excessive comments that aren't pertinent. We reserve the right to delete those if they violate our guidelines, or remove folks who aren't complying with those kind of general best practices. And with that said, I am really pleased to introduce our guest tonight, Art Cullen. Art is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, editor of the Storm Lake Times, which is a family-run weekly newspaper in small-town Iowa, Storm Lake, if the name didn't give it away, and the author of our featured book tonight, Storm Lake, A Chronicle of Change, Resilience, and Hope from a Heartland newspaper. Art has made his life's work to ask big questions, speak truth to power, and share struggles and successes in his unique community of Storm Lake. His new book is part cultural history, part memoir, which is a really fun thing for us to discuss here in Book Club. And it explores the themes of family, community, immigration, diversity, the meaning of home, and the Heartland's turbulent history and promising progressive future. As many of you know from reading this book, Art is an Iowa native who grew up in northern Iowa in both Kossuth and Buena Vista counties. And before returning to Storm Lake, he spent time working as a journalist in Algona, Ames, and Minneapolis, among other places. As a Northwest Iowa native myself, I told Art this earlier, it was really fun because I have family in the Storm Lake area, that as I read through this book again to prepare for the conversation, even passing references to places like Primgar and Lynn Grove were not lost on me. So it's been a real pleasure to have another Northwest Iowa native to talk to tonight. So thank you for joining us, Art. We're really glad you're here.
Well, thanks for having me, Andrew. I appreciate it.
Yeah, we're looking forward to it. To begin our conversation, I thought I wanted to start with this question, which is a little bit about the book itself, how it came together. You talk about it a little bit in the first parts of the book, but could you talk a little bit about the process of writing and reflecting on your work over the last several decades? Particularly your front row seat to many major events in Iowa history, but putting that together in a book, because unlike the newspaper, this is much longer, right? And you're bringing together different parts of that history that had played out over many years.
Well, yeah, I never entertained the idea of writing a book, and I just write 700 to 1,000 words at a time, and So after winning the Pulitzer, within a few days, I got calls from New York, two different New York publishers want me to write a book, and I laughed at them both and hung up the phone. I can't write a book. I can only go 1,000 words. And my brother John said, call them back and tell them you got a book. And I said, what the hell am I going to write about? And he says, I don't know, call it Storm Lake. So that's what we ended up with. And so like, I think you aptly described it there. It's a cultural history wrapped in sort of a memoir, threaded with a memoir. And but I'd never really thought about writing a book and how you structure a book, and that's evident when you read the book. It reads like a series of sketches and essays, I think, and that's what I had hoped to do, that string together essays into a theme of resilience that kind of traces actually all the way back to the glaciers.
I thought it was really interesting because it was written differently than a lot of history books that I read, right? But I thought it was done in a way that was compelling, in as much as you would go to a sketch and you might hear echoes of an earlier story, say of immigrants or of the land or the lake. We didn't just touch on, dredging the lake once, but it came up over and over again. And I thought that, as you described that structure, it makes sense to me now as I look at it, that it was written in that way that allowed us to carry these themes over a longer period of time. I thought that was really
it drove my editor crazy because I didn't have any real narrative arc. And, but I lacked the concentration span over 90,000 words to follow a storyline. So, but that's what I was trying to do, is deal with those kind of meta themes of agriculture, the environment, immigration, and sense of place, and who belongs here. Our sense of entitlement, to be here.
Yeah, that makes me think. I had one of the questions I had was about immigration, because it comes up so much, and I grew up with family in Alta and Aurelia and these areas that are not in Storm Lake but right next door, and we often heard about all the immigrants living in Storm Lake. When I went to all state tryouts in Storm Lake from my home in Heartland, Melvin, Sanborn, we knew there were lots of immigrants that lived in Storm Lake. So I wonder, it's just really interesting, and I wondered if you could talk a little bit about if or how you see kind of the current dynamic immigrant community that is Storm Lake, as a part of that longer trend that you've highlighted, whether that's back to the Thai Dam in the 70s after Vietnam, or even earlier with the Europeans. So like, is what Storm Lake is today, with its vibrant immigrant community, reflective of actually a longer history of how Storm Lake has continued to grow and reinvent itself over many years?
Yeah, well, certainly, there were, immigrant stories, even among the native people, when the Europeans started driving the Sac and Fox west. They crowded out the Iowa, and so we have immigration conflicts even between indigenous peoples. Before as the Europeans arrived. And then, of course, it was waves of immigrants. The railroad brought waves of immigrants to the prairie, Northwest Iowa, South Dakota, Southern Minnesota, in droves after 1850. And we broke the land, drained the marshes, polluted the lake, and created this system of industrial agriculture eventually that has us reaching our limits. And so I find that history fascinating to me, and how fast it's been. The glacier took millennia to form. we completely transformed within 150 years,
Yeah.
and perhaps into our undoing.
There's an interest. It reminds me of my ancestors arrived in Cherokee County, and we have a little picture that my one of my grandparents has, and it has writing on the back that just says "nothing here but grass," on it. That
Right.
they entered a world where there was only grass in Northwest Iowa as far as they could see. If they wanted trees, they had to travel quite. They were in the middle of Cherokee County, a little ways from the river. But what you're describing, right, is that was in the 1860s, and here we are 160 years later, and there's very little of that tall grass left, and it's normally ornamental, right?
And so there's this constant evolution involving both our relationship to the land and people, the immigrant story, and those two things are interwoven. So now Storm Lake is a community of, we think about 15,000 people, where 90% of our children, our elementary school enrollment, are children of color, mainly Latino, but from all over the world, Myanmar, Sudan, you name it, Cuba, but mainly Jalisco in Mexico. And so, and that interchange is between Mexico and the upper Midwest has been going on for 1,200 years or more. And so that's, and it's all revolves around corn and the land and that interchange. And it's interesting to me that the Latinos here now are actually indigenous people, who perhaps are related to the indigenous people that we drove out of here, by blood. And so those are the cycles I wanted to explore.
Yeah, it's interesting. You just talking about these kind of cycles and the long relationship with Mexico in particular. I worked with an author the summer of 2020 who had found evidence of Mexican migrant laborers in Storm Lake in the 1920s, and they didn't show up on any censuses, but she had found that they were there, and it was reflective too of what you're describing as this long relationship between these places, with people coming back and forth.
And then we erect these artificial barriers, and this bureaucratic immigration system that frustrates people's ambitions and dreams, and it holds Storm Lake back from becoming a whole community. So the implications are huge. And again, it's related to the land and how because it's all built, or this entire immigration thing is built around a corn, hog, ethanol complex, that this rich land gives rise to, and now we can barely sustain it.
It's interesting, talking with you just now about immigration and Northwest Iowa. I lived for many years in other larger areas, Dallas, Texas, Raleigh, Durham, North Carolina. And a lot of times there was a perception that rural folks, people who lived in the areas that I grew up in, that you live in now, didn't know anything about immigrants or people from other parts of the world. But I remember, talk to anybody, even in Northwest Iowa, and they know an immigrant. They know these folks. They see them often. I think there's that perception isn't accurate, right? That a place like Northwest Iowa doesn't have a sense of immigration when there are lots of immigrants in all kinds of all these small communities.
Well, it's certainly ironic that Steve King, who was kind of the leading anti-immigration zealot, Sioux County, up there in Dutch Reform country, is heavily undocumented immigrants, and working in those dairy barns, and everybody, for a long time was trying to act like it wasn't going on. uh, uh,
it's an interesting kind of it's something to appreciate, that perception, right, of places, small places being all kind of all white, actually, that there is much
yeah,
more
even among the people
diversity.
who live there, the dominant culture can't even see them.
Hmm.
And and that's a problem even for me in Storm Lake, being part of the Anglo dominant scheme here. You have a hard time seeing people,
Hmm. Hmm.
and
It
so
makes
I
me.
hope the book helps us uh, see some of these people.
Hmm. I that theme of seeing people, and reminds me too of one of the things you talk about, or is being small and being rural, or in a smaller area. And I wonder if you have any thoughts in particular about what, like a smaller place, a rural place, especially those areas around Storm Lake, what can they tell us that maybe larger places can't? What are people overlooking? We're thinking about seeing small places. A lot of times people overlook the Midwest or overlook non-urban places. And how does your book and the story you're telling kind of help us to see the small places that might get overlooked?
Well, I think one of the things that I hope is uh, people can see is the great frustration that exists in rural America.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and when I say rural America, I mean Clinton and Keokuk and Storm Lake, and those little tiny burgs that you drive through and you blink and you miss them.
Mm-hmm.
The
Mm-hmm.
tremendous frustration that as this economy has completely been turned upside down in the last 50 years by consolidation and constantly wrenching people out of the economy and driving them elsewhere. And uh, all of a sudden, people are storming the Minnesota state capitol or the Michigan state capitol, and we wonder why.
Mm-hmm. It
Uh,
it reminds me of, I was talking to my dad over Christmas break about the farm crisis, which, to increasingly, to young people is a historical event, but to people who are, probably in their 50s or older, is not a historical event. It was a thing that really shaped their lives.
Very fresh in my memory.
Mm-hmm. And so it makes me wonder, and so the farm crisis is the first thing that comes to mind when you talk about, some of these big shifts and driving people. I think about folks who weren't able to continue on farming and things like that. I just wondered, are there other big
Well,
events yeah.
before the farm crisis, there were 5 implement dealers in Algona, Iowa, and I think one survived.
Mm-hmm.
That changes a community.
Mm-hmm. I remember distinctly too. I went to elementary school in Hartley, Iowa. We lived in Sanborn. We were a consolidated school district. But I remember when the meatpacking plant there closed. And as I was reading your book, it was all kind of coming together, because I was a child when it was closing, and I didn't quite put together what was happening. But as I read your book, particular, and as I've studied history too, but it kind of pieced together these places closing, bringing things together, and how I've seen how that affected our little school district in our town. What it meant when that packing plant closed, or got smaller. I forget exactly how it worked
Yeah,
out.
so the average farm size, has doubled since 1980,
Mm-hmm.
and we have half as many farmers. And 67 of Iowa's 99 counties have lost population every year, essentially since 1920.
Mm-hmm.
But it's really just been exacerbated in the last, since 1980,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and that's really when we got into the get big or get out mentality, and following the 1970s, and
Mm-hmm.
it completely changed Iowa, and I think we're seeing the results of it now, uh, politically and culturally in
Mm-hmm.
Iowa, and it's coming home with force, I think
Mm-hmm.
now.
Are there, are there other big events, other than maybe we had the farm crisis, a few of the others. Are there other big events that you think about from your own career that you've documented that are also kind of affecting the way we live and experience the world today? So if that's probably one of the biggest, if not the biggest, what other major historical events might you point to and say, yeah, this is a thing that I've reflected on in the book, or maybe I didn't have a chance to, but I think is really affecting where we are today?
Well, that whole period, the whole Reagan Revolution really, set the stage for our contemporary economic and political scene, and we're seeing the fruition of it today in the idea of uh, taking it to its extreme, almost to, when Reagan said, get government off our backs. And then now we've gotten to the point where government is the enemy, and you're stampeding the capitals.
Mm-hmm.
And it really, and it kind of, the conservative movement took root. The evangelicals joined in with the conservative movement, and that was, at its root in Iowa. Pat Robertson won the Iowa caucuses,
Mm-hmm.
and that was all post-Reagan, and that it seems to me that's when everything changed, coincided with the farm crisis, which just kind of put change, on turbo drive.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's hard for me to envision other historical trends in my lifetime
Mm-hmm.
that have been more transformative to Iowa than the combination of the Reagan Revolution and the farm crisis.
Yeah.
And I think it puts us where we're at today,
Mm-hmm.
like I say, politically and economically.
Yeah. And
Where,
it's interesting.
where rural Iowa almost becomes a second world economy,
Mm-hmm.
and urban Iowa is flourishing.
Mm-hmm.
And there's two different societies.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting to think through, like that, and the way those coincide, the 1980s as this really turbulent period, both in the ideological frameworks that are happening politically or religiously, but also alongside the farm crisis, and how that, I think that's interesting to put them in conversation. I read a lot of history, and a lot of religious historians aren't doing agricultural history, and agricultural
Right.
historians aren't doing religious or political history. But the way you're putting them together,
and then when you start thinking about dominion over the earth,
mm-hmm.
And agriculture and religion and
Mm-hmm.
history, I mean, come on, that's
Mm-hmm.
what it's all about.
Yeah.
Driving out the native people, and so you can have dominion over the land, the livestock, and also, by the way, these what we believe to be savages.
Mm-hmm.
We have dominion over them too, and we have dominion over Latinos, and we have dominion over Blacks,
Mm-hmm.
and we have dominion over this land, and you're not going to tell me what to do with it.
Mm-hmm.
And that is the Iowa framework,
Yeah, it's interesting to.
But we don't want to talk about it. We're debating it right now in our legislature, that we don't even want to talk about that history.
I know I've worked with some of those sources, and we have there's quite a few. You can go back to those early periods and find really complex, really, how do I want to phrase it? You can find that logic being employed in a variety of settings, across. Anyway, it's a long way of saying it without going into all the primary sources I've looked at. I think it's a theme that
its manifest destiny is driving our history in Iowa, and I think we underappreciate it. And in fact, I might just write a book about
it. Here, take on another 90,000 word project.
Yeah.
You mentioned the land, and it gets me thinking again, back to the kind of environmental part of what you're doing. And I thought it was interesting, and you touched on it earlier, and I didn't want to let it pass before we get too far along, but that was the the relationship between the land and the people. And I know you don't frame what you were doing as necessarily an environmental history, but as I read it, there was kind of an environmental history that went alongside it. You were telling the story not just of the people of Storm Lake, but actually of the lake itself. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about that theme in particular, how understanding the history of environmental change and challenge can help us understand human change and challenge.
Well, yeah, what I was trying to get into is the idea of that the native people had of living within a landscape, and that you have to approach the landscape with some humility. And again, we approach the landscape with this idea of dominating it and turning those native flowers into corn, and we've done it. No place on earth is cultivated like Iowa is, and it created an entire culture built around that. Again, around that theme of Christian theme of kind of a distorted sense of stewardship that shapes where we're at today. How we approach the landscape. That means that you've got hog houses, polluting our rivers, and we have nitrogen fertilizer running from Iowa to the Gulf of Mexico.
It's
all driven by that same desire to so-called feed the world, a Christian obligation to feed the world. And what we're really doing is setting up a current environmental catastrophe.
Yeah, it's interesting. Well, and to hear like kind of those reflections about working with the land and what could be very earnestly believed, we're feeding the world, or we're also there's a sincerity to that belief and an honesty to it in my experience growing up.
Right.
And that can be held in tension with some of the negative effects of what it looks like to be doing that work of feeding the world. There can, at least in
that work of feeding the world became get big or get out, because these acres are going to be controlled by the export trade and by Monsanto. And I know I sound like a crazy populist, but it's a fact that when you've got well over $100 an acre in input costs, that's real money to the petrochemical industry that controls our acres. And you take 1 acre out, and that's $100 less for the Koch brothers in Wichita, and that's what shapes our economy, and that's why rural Iowa, why we're shipping our soil down the Mississippi River complex, and costing the city of Des Moines millions of dollars a year in cleaning up water, and now drilling new wells in our chase to feed the world. But what we're really feeding is hogs. And people are still starving in Sudan. And so are we really feeding the world, or are we feeding Monsanto? And are we feeding Smithfield and Tyson?
It's an interest. That highlights for me like the complicated, just how complicated food systems are,
Absolutely.
and the need to look clearly at the ways that food systems work. I'm looking at our time, and we're at 7:30, and I see a lot of questions from folks coming in. I have another question I want to ask.
Rattle on forever.
Yeah, I want to ask you, I've got one more question I'm going to ask, and then we'll go to the audience questions. So if you have questions that you want to drop in the Q&A, now is the time. But my last question is that I'm a trained historian, and I spent a lot of time reading old newspapers. Mine have often been in Dutch, which is neither here nor there. But someday, presumably, historians will read your newspaper and your words and the reporting you've done in the Storm Lake Times. And I wondered if you had any thoughts or reflections on the role that you, as a newspaper writer, a newspaper man, the role that you're playing in documenting history that people are going to look at for centuries after this. That future historians will read your words to try to make sense of this. How's that feel, or what do you think about that?
Well, they say journalism is the first rough draft of history.
Yeah.
And I try not to think about it because it's daunting. But that's what drives you is in this business, is to be able to document reality and facts for your current readership. And in the sense that becomes history, it's not something I ever really think about. Now, writing a book, you think about posterity. But when you're in the moment putting a paper out, you're thinking about the immediate effects of a tax increase, a property tax increase on the school district.
Yeah. I imagine too, in my experience as an editor too, I'm often thinking about deadlines and word counts. And so there's all these other things going on in my mind. In addition to getting good history published, I'm also thinking, how many pages am I at? How many words am I at? When is that deadline?
Then when you look back on it and you see, wow, that really does tell a story of, in 1990, we were doing feature stories about independent pork producers. By 1998, they had all disappeared. They were gone by the year 2000. There were no independent producers left. And that is a historical chronicle. And it will be interesting to see what people say when they look back and say, what happened to that farmer? Where'd he go?
Yeah. I have done that many times, in my own research, following someone or following the ways that people had talked about something, and all of a sudden it disappears, and wondering where it goes. It always is tricky as a historian, but we appreciate very much those who are writing those newspapers, because we're going to draw on them for a long time going forward. So with that, we've got lots of questions coming in from the audience. So I'm going to turn it over to the audience questions, and I'll just read those for you as we go. And so the first one's kind of about you, and it's just what do you attribute the growth or the development of your worldview? So how did you come to think and experience and look at the world the way you do?
Well, I was the youngest of 6 siblings, and who were all fairly smart. My parents were, Irish Catholic, New Dealers, and so I was born in 1957, and Dad ran on the Kennedy ticket in 1961 for state legislature. So that kind of explains in Buena Vista County, where they actually had a cross burning. So that kind of explains they were, quixotic, going against the grain in Buena Vista County, and we go against the grain. This is red Farm Bureau country up here, and we go against the grain, but it's the way we were born. I can't help it. And that's how we were raised. That the mom wanted us to be either first a U.S. senator. First a priest, then a U.S. senator, or an orthodontist. And, so all our kids ended up in the newspaper business.
Yeah. Well, that's. I'm sure she made it. I'm sure she found a way to find her peace with newspapers rather than teeth or.
Why didn't you go to law school like your Uncle Jimmy?
Yeah.
You could have been in the U.S. Senate.
There you go. Oh, well, so then there's another question I see here that's kind of related, but especially to the book. And it says, there's really three sets of discussions that are kind of happening in the book. There's the memoir, there's reflection on Storm Lake, and then there's kind of the larger Iowa history. So this person was just wondering, why did you decide to include all three in the book? And I might add, how do you see them kind of in conversation with each other as a part of the book?
Well, because what I've always, for many years, thought that there was there were about three big forces swirling around overhead Storm Lake. A lot of big national stories come into focus right in this little isolated place in the middle of nowhere, and that is agriculture, immigration, and the environment. And so that's what I really wanted to do, is talk about those three things, and then using Storm Lake as the motif for it. And then the book editor wanted a family thread through the book, and they wanted it to be more of a memoir, and I had wanted it to be more of a screed on agricultural consolidation and our approach to the landscape. And they wanted more of a memoir, so I mixed up a little bit and tried to make my little funny little story a thread that attempted to try to tie together these bigger themes of agriculture, the environment, and immigration, and especially climate change, because climate change is rapidly changing us and our landscape.
Yeah. I appreciated the family thread in particular, if for no other reason than as someone whose family had different experiences, but similar ones growing up and living in Cherokee County. It was easier, I could think about the themes that you were discussing in ways that were resonant with, my great grandparents who arrived and then, developed.
My ancestors were involved in chasing out Inkpaduta, for the last Dakota man standing in Iowa, and they were also involved intimately in draining the sloughs of northern Iowa. My grandfather, Art Murray, drained about the northern half of Kossuth County. Well, and his exploits essentially funded the Storm Lake Times, which then became a critic of the agricultural drainage situation. So it's an irony, and I thought that was an irony worth pursuing in the book. Our family thread kind of ties into the immigrant story, immigrants coming in and driving out the Dakota who had driven out the Iowa, right? And then also having an impact in these other areas, the environment and agriculture. We're all involved in that history. And I'm involved in it my through my lineage.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear you talk about the northern Kossuth County, which if my history is right, was once Bancroft County that was given up because it was so full of marshes and too wet to be farmed, and then that really it was that changing of the environment that allowed northern Kossuth County to actually be tillable land where it once was too marshy. So
that's when my grandfather created like 9 farms out of those marshes through drainage, and he was instrumental in it, and he was instrumental in setting up many of the problems that we're seeing today with the Des Moines Waterworks, where the nitrate loads are so high, and so it's all a connected history.
So another kind of this one about immigration, and do you see other Northwest Iowa county seats that are looking to recruit immigrants, especially communities like Spencer or Cherokee, and probably the larger ones, because there's a for whoever, I'm not sure who asked this, but I would say in Northwest Iowa you have the Cherokees and you have the Spencers, but then you have also the Sibleys and the Primgars, which are significantly smaller. So not all Northwest Iowa county seats are created equal.
No, several years ago, during a caucus cycle, there was a reporter from the New York Times who was doing a focus group in Pocahontas, And I went over to listen to it. Pocahontas is a town of about 1,800 people, maybe, and 30 miles from Storm Lake. And at one time, it was really a thriving county seat town. It just got the hell beat out of it by the farm crisis. The Catholic school closed, businesses were closed, and it just got the wind knocked out of it. And this guy said, "Well, would you accept immigrants? And would you, like Storm Lake? Would you want to have 50 to 75% of your town being immigrants?" And they said, "Well, maybe 20%." So they want to make sure the people who have their hands on the levers want to make sure their hands stay on the levers, and they don't want Pablo running the courthouse.
Mm-hmm.
And they're willing to accept about 20%, but not 51%. They want Anglos in control. And so that's the latent racism and that's what drives the frustration. White people seeing that they were sold a bill of goods, and you can't even blame the Mexican guy anymore because we locked them out. So hell, let's go charge the Capitol then.
Yeah, so I'm trying to find a good segue to the next question, but I may just have to jump there after, because we've got a nice mix. So I apologize to just jump to a different topic, but that was our one kind of immigration question. It's funny you mentioned Pocahontas as well, because my brother lives in Pocahontas, so I have connections to that community as well. But this one is.
And that's funny because at one time it was a bohemian community. It was half Czech.
Mm-hmm.
And they had a English speaking church and a Czech speaking church, Catholic churches. And so it was an immigrant community. In that short a time, people had decided they didn't really want immigration, even though the town is dying.
So this is the next question. Some of these are about the film, which are connected to, I believe is related.
Great movie.
Yeah. So they've got a couple film questions, and one of them is in the film. Tom, Tom talks about the challenges of growing up as a Cullen in Storm Lake, and so this is probably maybe similar to or on some of your earlier answers. And how has the family and how the family has a culture of excellence. So difficult to grow up as a Cullen in Storm Lake, and you have a family as a culture of excellence. Was that true for you and John and your other siblings as well? Did you have that experience?
Well, our parents had very high expectations, to which I consistently underdelivered. And but yeah, and they had high expectations of us. And I told my mom I was going to the University of Iowa, and she said, "The hell you are." And she said, "You're going to St. Thomas." And she called the Iowa a government school. And no son of mine's going to a government school. So yeah, that's the way we were raised. And it was a different time and a different era. And they were Irish, very Irish. And you had to present yourself in such a way that you didn't embarrass the race. And now look at my hair. Now I'm a complete embarrassment to the Irish race.
Another question, this is also related to the film, which we'll have a link to that we'll send along to folks too. We've got it around. Great. So this is the new documentary. But in the book, the news hound's name is Mabel, but in the film it's Peach. And so there's somebody who wants to know why or what's up with that.
Yeah, Mabel went in with a bad tooth, and they put her under to pull her tooth, and she had an enlarged heart and never came out of the anesthesia. So 2 weeks later, we had another dog from the pound. So that didn't last long. Mabel gave way to Peach. And so Peach rules our office now.
So there you go.
Yeah. God bless Mabel.
Yeah. So I'm looking at questions here. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the future of other small towns. So if you have, I'm thinking this is a question about other small towns, particularly of those on maybe the periphery of Storm Lake. So your Altas, your Aurelias, Sioux Rapids, so what's the future of small towns that are outside of or pursuing different paths from Storm Lake?
Well, most of them showed population declines to the last census, predictably. And, Alta is a bedroom community for Storm Lake, and it's got a future. And, Aurelia is kind of, between Storm Lake and Cherokee, and that's on a highway, so it's all right. But there's really this steady rural erosion going on. And, it's these, and what I'm really worried about, and Dave Swenson is a really smart Iowa State University regional trade economist. He's very concerned about these towns like Mason City, Fort Dodge, Clinton, Marshalltown, and how they've really taken a beating as manufacturing left Iowa. And how wages have eroded and college education. If you have a college education, there's no job in, Iowa Falls to support you. And so, old wine and all these old industrial manufacturing centers, and there's this metamorphosis going on, and it's pretty rapid. And explains a lot of the Obama to Trump voting phenomenon. And I think that's, I hate to put it this way, but I kind of gave, Nemaha died a long time ago. Nemaha is a little community in Sac County, just south of Storm Lake, and it doesn't have all it has left is a Methodist church. And it's strictly a bedroom community for Storm Lake. So it died a long time ago with the automobile, probably. But what I'm really concerned about is those mid-sized cities in Iowa that really kind of made the culture of Iowa. The population is spread evenly throughout the state. And now that's changing rapidly again. Cedar Rapids, Iowa City, Des Moines, Ames are sucking people out of those communities, and they're having a really tough time. Storm Lake is doing pretty well because it's a meatpacking town that's been growing through immigration. And so there's a different dynamic going on here, but there's still a lot of challenges because of a low wage base.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear you talk about, the industrial centers. That strikes me because a lot of the concern, I grew up in a very small town of about 1,000, or maybe a little bit more than that, but my hometown is decreased in population, but just a little bit. It's very slow. I mean, it knows how to be small, right. But some of those places that have lost those wages,
but Kossuth County's lost 50% of its population since 1945. And Bancroft, where my mom is from, there's no school there anymore. And that was the county seat of Crocker County, as that northern county that was then absorbed by Kossuth. And now Bancroft doesn't even have a school.
Yeah, we see that those kinds of the schools are how important they are, for continuing to.
And now they're losing newspapers, and Jessup is the Jessup newspapers closing now. That's a town of 2,000 some people, and the newspaper's closing. And what happens to the community with the newspaper closes? Well, it really starts to unravel as a community. And if there's no school, no newspaper, what is it?
Yeah, I think a lot of what you're talking about, really resonates with my experience growing up in a small town, and how much we liked getting, at the time it was the Sanborn Pioneer, and I think they still publish it up there in Sanborn, and we had our middle school, and there still is a Christian school in town, but we took pride in our school and in our newspapers, and we were a small town, smaller than 2,000, but I know they still are real.
They're enduring, and
Yeah.
they are enduring, and but they lack that. If you're in Sanborn now, it's not the same Sanborn that you grew up in. It
Yeah.
doesn't have the same sort of stability and security and sense of community that you once knew.
And a lot of what one of our major employers is milk processing, AMPI, up there in Sanborn, that gives us, makes sure we have a consistent source of jobs. So I could talk about this for a long time, but I want to get to a few more questions because we've got lots of them, and thank you so much for offering them to everyone. We'll do our best to get to as many as possible. But one of them is also related to the film and to the book, but now there's been a new documentary out about Storm Lake. There's been your book, and the Pulitzer. So there's been a lot of attention on Storm Lake, at least it seems to be. Have you noticed any changes taking place because of that increased attention? What does it look like with some more folks with their eyes on Storm Lake?
Well, I don't know, because Storm Lake is such a dynamic community. It's difficult to tell what outside influence the film might have because there are people are leaving for Mexico right now from Storm Lake, and they might be back in 2 months when it warms up. So Storm Lake is a very dynamic place, and it's really unlike any place in Iowa in that respect.
Yeah.
Very transitory, and but I think the film is really, first of all, I think it's a loving portrait of the community, and by Jerry Rishis, who was raised on a hog farm near Buffalo Center, up near Bancroft, where my mom grew up. And in fact, Jerry's farm was in Kossuth County, and it gives this portrait of the community as a place that still works. And because we're trying to speak to each other, and so they're using the newspaper as the vehicle through which the community speaks to each other. And so it's working here because we work really hard at it. It's a kind of an anomaly for rural America.
Yeah, I think so. So a related question then that I'm seeing here too is that if Storm Lake is unique or is an anomaly, as you've mentioned, does that help us to give a good sense of rural America more broadly, or is this an exception? And if it's an exception, what do we do with that?
Yeah, well, I think it can be held up as kind of a model of how a rural community can play the hand it's dealt. We didn't necessarily want to see the Union busted back in 1980, and we didn't want to see all those farm boys who work nights disappear from the meatpacking plant. That was the way they were going to buy the farm. They ended up in Oklahoma or Texas. And so but time marches on, and what are you going to do? They busted the unions, they consolidated the meatpacking industry. IBP has taken over the world, and so we're going to make the most of it, and we did. And even though the wages were cut in half from $12.75 an hour down to $6.50 an hour overnight when IBP came into town, and they brought in 300 Laotian refugees, and that took the community some getting used to, but they got used to it. And The Laotians, were fantastic citizens and saved their money, worked their butts off, and now are, have owned their own homes and
Mhm.
just like everybody else. So it all worked out. But we're still struggling, like I say, with that as as these corporations have consolidated and increased their leverage over America and broken the backs of unions, wages were suffering, and so we're still trying to catch up. And then now wages are starting to catch up, and guess what? Then they start blaming the workers for inflation,
Mhm.
or relief programs for inflation, which is
Yeah.
absolutely absurd. But that's what you're hearing now. It's the worker, wages are the driving inflation. No, it wasn't wages, it was profiteering
Mhm.
in the energy and food markets. Well, there,
Mhm.
I can get it going on another editorial there.
Mhm. Well, so I've got another question here for you. I've got this. There's a viewer who's here who's from Storm Lake originally, but now is living
Oh,
out of state. And this individual wants to know, they subscribe to the Times, but are there other things then that someone who isn't living in Storm Lake can do to support, not just to support local papers, but maybe more generally, but also maybe the work you're doing?
well, yeah, we actually we started uh, before the pandemic. It was the pandemic was coming on. Uh, a few newspapers got in Western Iowa. We could see the freight train coming. I mean, business was deteriorating before the pandemic for these rural newspapers, independent family-owned newspapers. And Fairway quit advertising, and then the pandemic hit, uh, we were thinking real seriously about just hanging it up, and that's reflected in this documentary. We were just about ready to bag it, and then we started this GoFundMe campaign, and that bailed us out along with the PPP. And then we got together with a friend at the Carroll Times Herald and started something called the Western Iowa Journalism Foundation, which can accept donate. It's a nonprofit that supports these newspapers. Uh, and as advertising has disappeared, we're turning to philanthropy to supplant that advertising revenue.
Mhm.
So far, we've raised over $300,000 this year for 5 newspapers: the Storm Lake Times, the Carroll Times Herald, the Jefferson Herald, La Prensa, and then we're also working with the Coon Rapids Enterprise.
Mhm.
And our goal is to be able to support independent family-owned community newspapers throughout rural Iowa as we can
Mhm.
raise more money. So,
Mhm.
and it's going to be necessary for newspapers, especially small newspapers like ours that can't grow our audience like the New York Times can.
Yeah.
It's going to be really important for these community newspapers to get community support through philanthropy to survive,
Mhm.
frankly, because this our business model is badly is badly fractured. Uh, we're not the advertising middleman anymore, and
Mhm.
we've got to find a way to support these newspapers that actually do support democracy at the grassroots.
Yeah, it's just interesting to hear about those efforts. I wasn't aware of the GoFundMe or the organization, but the ways that that's working to
Western
support
Iowa
West
Journalism Foundation.com.
Foundation.com. There you
If
go.
you're wealthy, call me.
Oh, wonderful. Well, we have about 2 minutes left in our time together, and I've got one last question. There were so many questions that came through. We didn't have a chance to answer all of them, and so if I didn't get to yours, I do apologize. We did our very best, but as I kind of expected, there was lots of questions. So
Why did
last,
God make us? To know us, love it, and serve Him? That's the big question, right?
yeah.
Why did God make us?
Well, it's a good segue to our last question, which really is, where is the hope that you referred to in the title of your book? I thought that would be a great way to end, to just spend our discussion.
Well, for me, I'm looking at climate change, and the hope for me is we know how to fix it. We know exactly what we need to do. Right, in agriculture, we know exactly what we need to do to stop surface water pollution, and that everybody can make money at it and be prosperous at it, and that we can revitalize these rural communities through a more sustainable and resilient agriculture that nature is forcing us right now, not in the future, but right now, to adjust. And for example, cover crops. Farmers are starting to plant cover crops to help build soil health, stop surface water pollution, and maybe sequester a little bit of carbon. And we're making progress. We are making progress on that front. The practical farmers of Iowa are doing great work in sustainable and regenerative agriculture. And so we know how to do it. Iowa State University knows that planting prairie strips between rows of corn can eliminate nitrogen loss from fields by up to 90%. That fixes the problem in the Gulf of Mexico, the hypoxia death of the Gulf of Mexico. We can fix that damn near overnight if we put our minds to it. But right now we're talking about banning books in schools, and we're not talking about hypoxia in the Gulf of Mexico so much.
Mhm.
And so if we could focus our attention on the problem at hand, which is California's on fire, we know how to fix it, and we can do it, and we can make money off electric cars, and we can make money growing switchgrass for hydrogen fuel cell production. Princeton says we can make 5 times more per acre growing switchgrass for hydrogen fuel cells than we can grow in corn for ethanol. And nobody starves. It's just that you switch that acreage. Again, that solves our surface water pollution problem.
Mhm.
There's all these approaches that are available to us where farmers can prosper, but we've got to break through the money cycle that keeps us from it, and it's sort of a colonialization of Iowa by corporate America, and we can break the cycle, but we've got to do it fast. Again, California's on fire. And it's not going to be so long before we can't grow corn in southern Iowa. And so we got to get on the stick, but we can do it.
Yeah, it's inspiring to hear the ways that you're framing, the ways that we do know that there are answers out there, whether that's climate change, as you talked earlier about immigration, that there are models of things that are working. I think that's a very hopeful place to end. And I'm also glad you mentioned the practical farmers, because we had a question about that earlier. So that was one of the questions we couldn't get to. So hopefully that viewer has at least something of an answer on that through that. But with that answer, we are at our time for tonight, that we are at 8 o'clock. I think we can all agree this has been a really informative chat, a very wide-ranging and engaging, and we're just so grateful, Art, for you to have joined us. But I also want to thank everyone else who's joined us this evening. It's been really enjoyable, and we've just been honored to be able to speak to you tonight, Art. We hope everyone will sign up for our next book club, where we'll be moving from Northwest Iowa to Southwest Iowa to discuss Richard Bennett's Mormons at the Missouri. We'll be also going back in time to the 1840s. At that meeting will take place in April, and we'd love to see you there. Look for our full book club schedule on our website. For more information about this, or to register for future webinars, please check out the website. It'll have everything that you need. Also, information about Goldie's Kids Club, which is for young historians, video recordings of our Iowa 101 series, which is hosted by our team here in Des Moines, or our Iowa Stories series, which is hosted by our Iowa City branch. You can also subscribe to the Annals if you want to, where we publish cutting edge research on Iowa history. And with that, I think that is everything. Thanks so much again, Art, and everyone who is here. It's been such a pleasure, and have a wonderful evening, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.